everybody for joining us. We have a very exciting day today for the monthly meeting of the Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. And Vivek, thanks for putting the program together. Rakesh, you are the star performer for today's session. And therefore, without wasting much time, I hand over back to Vivek to start the proceedings. Over to you, Vivek.
Yeah. So today, Dr. Rakesh Gopal, who is a fully trained cardio-oncologist among us, a very rare breed in India, is going to enlighten us about different aspects of cardio-oncology. So without much ado, I would request Dr. Rakesh Gopal to start his lecture, following which we will be having exciting questions and answers. Thank you.
Cancer and arrhythmia is something quite common. And arrhythmia in general, even general population, is quite common. So if you look at the patients admitted with cancer in any cancer hospital, you will see some 10% of them will have prolonged QTC. Patients with cancer who are under therapy are still at higher risk of developing cardiac arrhythmias. And most of the most of the drugs which is used in oncology these days is primarily tested. The primary testing process itself includes the exclusion of cardiac arrhythmias. We can see ventricular arrhythmias and QT prolongation associated with a variety of drugs, including cyclin-dependent kinase inhibitors, TKIs, ibrutinib, arsenic trioxide, anthracyclines. But it is most commonly and most frequently is described with 5-fluorouracil. Bradyarrhythmias are very, very common in cancer patients, and it is most of the time of no consequence except in patients who are treated with immune checkpoint inhibitors, where the complete heart block is very common and it can be life-threatening. Many patients who undergo surgery for cancer are prone for developing atrial arrhythmias. And AF in this occasion may actually be associated with a bad outcome in hospital heart failure, thromboembolism, in hospital death, delayed recovery time, and a bad outcome at the end of 1 year. Anthracyclines. There's really high incidence of atrial fibrillation even when the patient does not have LV dysfunction. Patient with LV dysfunction typically on anthracycline will develop ventricular tachycardias and may have ventricular fibrillation even. Melphalan is another drug strongly implicated in atrial fibrillation. Melphalan, when used in stem cell transplantation, even for the conditioning, the pre-transplant AF was about 13.1% in patients who are treated with high dose of melphalan. And 11% of these patients had an incidence of supraventricular arrhythmia, which included atrial fibrillation. In melphalan-treated patients, the post-transplant AF is associated with the very bad outcomes. And it prolongs hospital stay, it can cause in-hospital death, and it can increase the incidence of death at the end of 1 year. Few words about carfilzomib. There is a remarkably high incidence of atrial fibrillation in people or with multiple myeloma, and the majority of them are actually patients who are treated with carfilzomib. It can also cause a syndrome in as high as 45 to 50% of the patients where the LV function is relatively preserved, but patient has atrial fibrillation, a very stiff ventricle, and they go in for heart failure. It may be really difficult to distinguish between the patient with amyloid heart disease when carfilzomib is particularly administered and useful. And in cardiac amyloidosis, when you give carfilzomib, it may not actually cause much of LV systolic dysfunction, but most of the carfilzomib related LV atrial fibrillation is also associated with LV dysfunction. Rate of AF significantly, if you compare other proteasome inhibitors, carfilzomib is definitely associated with a much higher incidence of atrial fibrillation, maybe about 3.2% compared with bortezomib, it's about 2.2%. One of the retrospective analysis clearly showed the AF incidence to be about 3.8%. So whatever said and done, if you have a patient on carfilzomib, you may have to really reassure him a lot that they have an increased incidence of atrial fibrillation, but since the drug is quite effective, we may have to effectively treat the atrial fibrillation and continue patient on carfilzomib. So just because patient developed atrial fibrillation, cessation of therapy with carfilzomib is actually not indicated. And this is something I really would like to emphasize, that most of the oncotherapies, not this carfilzomib, even when the patients develop cardiac side effects, I would say majority of these patients can actually continue to have the chemotherapy or cancer cure therapy rather than stopping it. There are some controversial aspects to it, except maybe in some patients who develop acute myocardial infarction with 5-fluorouracil. If you reintroduce the drug, the risk of cardiac event rates may actually be high, and the risk of death may be as high as something like 13%. But majority of the centers, including ours, and in my own personal experience, we have been re-challenging with the patients who have been on 5FU and they develop acute myocardial infarction. And there's another aspect. Let us not go to that in details. Tyrosine kinase inhibitors, when combined with 5-fluorouracil especially, sorafenib is associated with 5% incidence of atrial fibrillation. But something more interesting is about ponatinib. This is a very interesting drug. It is associated with atrial fibrillation 3% of the patients compared to patients who are receiving imatinib. Imatinib is a wonderful drug, and it is the first drug developed in this regard, the tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and that drug was not associated with major adverse events, though it can cause fluid loss and heart failure. The imatinib is a wonderful drug because it is devoid of most of the side effects of the other tyrosine kinase inhibitors, including arrhythmias. Ponatinib is surprisingly associated with an increased incidence of atrial thrombi. There is notice in the EPIC trial, and these atrial thrombi predispose patients to thromboembolism. So that's actually a problem. Ponatinib is also associated with abnormalities of the platelet function that can predispose patients for bleeding. And still interesting is that the ponatinib treated patients, if they have thrombocytopenia or the platelet dysfunction, they have a lot of interactions with warfarin too. So if you put this patient on ponatinib, who already have atrial thrombi, which is likely to embolize, if they have atrial fibrillation or not, and if you're going to anticoagulate with warfarin, be very careful. You should not probably do that. But in this regard, the NOACs are really useful. NOACs do not have this particular event rates. Bosutinib is also a culprit in causing many patient atrial fibrillation. But bosutinib is not really a problematic drug in terms of thromboembolism. And patients, despite developing atrial fibrillation, you may be able to anticoagulate them and then continue on bosutinib. Nilotinib is also implicated in causing atrial fibrillation, but the incidence is very, very low, so that this drug is considered quite safe. The mechanisms of the involvement, mechanism of atrial fibrillation in these patients may be due to inhibition of the PI3K kinase signaling pathway. Ibrutinib, another drug, the Brunton tyrosine kinase inhibitor, there may be a 2 to 16% incidence of atrial fibrillation. And one meta-analysis by Yoon et al. Showed 8% compared to placebo and other agents, and increases it's really the incidence of atrial fibrillation increases with the prolonged use of the drug, and also if the dose is higher. It also acts by the IP3K and AKT pathway inhibition, which is the reason for causing atrial fibrillation, and it has got inherent antiplatelet effects leading to bleeding. And you should not combine ibrutinib with warfarin at all. NOACs in this patient may actually be safer. The management of atrial fibrillation is similar to that of the general population as things stands now. The one important reason why this patient needs treatment is to prevent tachycardiomyopathy. If the patient has atrial fibrillation fast ventricular rate, it can precipitate heart failure, and even if normal LV function with fast heart rates, patients can subsequently develop tachycardiomyopathy. That's an important reason why they need to be treated. And there's always a point and contention that whether we should control the rhythm or the rate. And the rhythm control strategy is generally not superior to rate control strategies. That's been proved in AFFIRM trial and ORBIT atrial fibrillation trial. So you can very well go for a strategy which controls the rate, because the rhythm control is associated with the use of mostly the antiarrhythmic drugs, and all antiarrhythmic drugs are actually pro-arrhythmic, and the rhythm control alone is not associated with a good outcome compared to rate control alone. However, having said that, you have to still depends on the charts and WASC, the score for estimation of the risk of thromboembolism. Again, as things stands now, because there is no particular specific validated score for cancer patients alone, I think somebody is going to talk about it. Coming to the ventricular arrhythmias and QT prolongation, as I mentioned, is actually is a surrogate marker, but the QT prolongation per se is not a really sensitive the parameter to see if the patient is at risk of developing ventricular fibrillation. Ventricular fibrillation, unlike AF, is associated with more of sudden cardiac death. It may be caused by things like or precipitated by electrolyte disturbances, systemic inflammatory responses, maybe a primary toxicity of the drug which is causing QT prolongation. But majority of the patients do have ischemia, and majority of these patients actually have valvular dysfunction. So the cancer patients with prolonged QTC, I mean, this prolonged QTC is the presumed cause of SCD in patients, especially when the newer therapies are being tried. But this assumption doesn't hold true for the general population. And 80% of the patients who develop VT in the general population, the etiology is ischemia. But when it comes to cancer patients on cancer therapy, this ischemia is not the predominant cause, but it is still about, it's actually prolonged QTC. This is more assumed than real. Nobody really knows. And this has been the contention, and that's been going on. And since these patients don't develop acute MI, especially, except in patients with 5FU, it may be reasonable to assume like that. The evidence for sudden cardiac death is low with all newly developed anti-cancer therapies, especially since the monitoring and the clinical testing has been extensive. The incidence of SCD in these patients are really, really low. But there is a problem with that in that case, because patients who have advanced cancer and those patients who have a very low incidence of SCD in cancer, we may actually be either underestimating these events as such. In general, QTC, which is more than 500 milliseconds, is associated with Torsades de Pointes arrhythmia, and this is a difficult arrhythmia to treat because cardioversion can actually worsen it. And if the patient has QTC more than 500 milliseconds, if you can increase the heart rate either by pacing or by giving something like theophylline, or you can give the terbinafine. If you keep the heart rate higher, the risk of arrhythmias can be significantly reduced. And also, you can correct the electrolytes and at the same time avoid drugs which can cause the prolonged QTC. The arsenic, we'll come to it in detail. Before that, let me speak something about 5-fluorouracil. 5-fluorouracil is like a real trigger which causes myocardial infarction in patients with cancer. The coronary ischemia is largely due to vasospasm, and these vasospastic events may be associated with ventricular arrhythmia. There is actually a significant increase in the VPC, the ventricular premature complexes, before and during the first 24 hours of infusion of 5FU. And it should be noted that this incidence of about NSVT and VT in patients who treated with 5FU is about 3.7%. And this incidence can so funnily be noted even before starting infusion. That there may be some kind of anticipation may also be valid in this regard. So this incidence of 3.7% risk of 5FU related NSVT and VT is reported from Pakistan. But meta-analysis of about 5 trials where the 5FU was used showed about an incidence only 0.16%. Abdul Rahman et al. Have clearly shown this data. So actually we may be dealing with much less incidence of VT In patients 5-fluorouracil, though the incidence of myocardial infarction is is high in this patient. So many oncologists do believe that capecitabine increases the risk of, may not be associated with an increased risk of myocardial infarction. It's not so. Capecitabine also is associated with almost same number of events as acute myocardial infarction. And in fact, capecitabine may increase the risk of ventricular fibrillation. This telemetry in these patients who are on 5FU, will it help? Is not really being usually used and probably not required. 5FU patients need not be on telemetry. Telemetry used to be a big thing when during times of the cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial. But in these patients who are long QT, we no longer monitor as a continuous the electrocardiography monitoring, but we do take ECG in them. Anthracyclines, really, it may not be a direct effect of the drug causing prolonged QTC, but most of the time the VTs associated with anthracyclines are related with LV dysfunction. But less than 1% of the population, less than 1% of the patients on anthracyclines do have prolonged QTC, but this QTC prolongation is usually not more than 500 milliseconds, and that is probably not the reason why these patients develop VT. If you look at those patients with LV dysfunction who require ICD implantation, which follows anthracycline-induced cardiomyopathy, you can see that the incidence of VT is about 73.9% and VF in about 30.4%. And these incidence is not significantly different when you compare those patients who have LV dysfunction with other reasons. So the anthracycline-induced LV dysfunction and ischemic non-ischemic cardiomyopathies, LV dysfunction, the incidence of VT and VF is same. Significant number of these patients, the anthracyclines, also have NSVT. So NSVT may be a predictor of much malignant arrhythmias in future than actually incidence of ventricular fibrillation. You should infer that anthracycline really do not have much of an influence on the cardiac electrical system as such. The arrhythmia in this regard is actually related to the LV dysfunction. Interestingly, bradyarrhythmias are extremely common. If you look at the data, I have mentioned that about 10% of the patients at the age of 70 years will have atrial fibrillation as the predominant and dominant rhythm. Same way, 4% of the people above the age of 40 years have bradycardia. The incidence of bradycardia may be very higher in patients who are young and who are athletic, and especially the tennis players kind of people have much slower heart rates. And even without any of these things, 4% of the people above the age of 40 have bradycardia. So what happens is when these patients are in the hospital and when somebody is monitoring, you see this patient's heart rate is low and it's really causes alarm. Especially in the middle of the night, you may be called to say to hear that some patient has a heart rate of 34 or 40, and patient may be comfortably be sleeping. So that is asymptomatic bradycardia in these patients are not associated with any bad outcome, including cancer patients. However, the most bradycardia in patients with cancer really has nothing to do with cancer. Though the anti-cancer drugs can cause bradycardia, majority of the cancer patients who have bradycardia, the cancer is not the reason for the bradycardia. Taxanes, especially the paclitaxel, is associated with 29% risk of sinus bradycardia, and this is almost always of no clinical significance. In one series, 2 out of 140 patients had higher AV block, and in fact, one of the patients who really required PPI, the permanent pacemaker implantation. These patients who requires some kind of permanent pacing are actually the patients who have associated conduction system disease. So taxanes per se, though they cause bradycardia, it does not cause a significant bradyarrhythmia of significance unless the patient has underlying conduction system disease or they are on other drugs. And majority of the patients on taxane hardly ever requires telemetry for monitoring because outcomes are benign. The only bradycardia which is deadly among those patients who are treated with cancer is the complete heart block associated with myocarditis. One big problem with these patients are that the myocarditis may be really subtle, and the primary presentation patient comes to you maybe with a complete heart block. So many patients with immune myocarditis can present with a complete heart block as an indicator of myocarditis, and it can be rapidly be fatal unless you intervene. High dose of the steroid is indicated in this patient to the tune of something like 1,000 milligrams of steroid. And if you don't do that, I mean, a majority of the patients who survived immune myocarditis, who had complications like heart failure and conduction block, are the ones who were on methylprednisolone in the dose in excess of something like 600 milligrams per day. So, in fact, those patients who are on immune checkpoint inhibitors, if they have complete heart block, the threshold for pacing must be very low. You should be ready to pace. In fact, our patients who did have the complete heart block on immunotherapy, we have paced them, and the patients did require permanent pacing because we are not sure how long these patients will require a temporary pacing, and temporary pacing is associated with some problems in those patients who have already immune inflammation of the heart. The risk of perforation will be more with those patients who have a temporary leads which are quite stiff, and there may be an increased risk of infections, and they may require really prolonged pacing. So we do prefer permanent pacing in most of these patients, though the centers could vary. I may be questioned on that. Before I close off, a few words about radiation. Radiation causes myocardial fibrosis. It can cause ischemia. It can cause direct damage to myocardium. And right bundle branch block is very common in those patients who get mediastinal irradiation, because it is more surface, more on the surface of the myocardium than the left bundle branch block is much more deeper. And complete heart block can occur in those patients who receive radiation. Usually it's a long-term outcome that may be out of fibrosis and calcification, and it may also be due to the direct damage to the conduction system in the AV node. And typically these patients who receive more than 40 gray and are the ones who develop a complete heart block later on. And most of the presentation, as I mentioned, is of course late, something like 10 years after the radiation. And the patients who have childhood exposure may actually come to you with a persistent tachycardia than complete heart block. The reason is not very clearly known, but it may be associated with dysautonomia. The damage to the autonomic nervous system can lead to a persistent tachycardia. But these patients do not have a major significant bad outcome because most of the time it's sinus bradycardia. And if this patient have SVT or atrial fibrillation, that may be associated with significant incidence of LV dysfunction. So patients who have left breast cancer, they have received radiation to the left breast, especially those patients who were treated earlier without adequate shielding, or less specific or forms of radiation was not available. And when they subsequently develop, even escalate trastuzumab, they are associated with cardiac arrhythmias. And I think I should stop here, and any questions are welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gopal. I think there are lots of questions, so you can take one by one.
Yeah, sure.
And the questions are displayed on the slide.
I can read it. I'm told that all antiarrhythmic drugs can also cause arrhythmia. Is this true? And so how significant is the problem in cancer patients? See, essentially all the antiarrhythmic drugs are pro-arrhythmic. All of them. You'd have heard of some famous trial called CAST, cardiac arrhythmia suppression trial. There are all sorts of the antiarrhythmic drugs were tried in different patients with arrhythmias, GPCs, and trial was stopped prematurely. You know why? The arms which contained antiarrhythmic drugs, the more patients died. So, including amiodarone, all of them are pro-arrhythmic. So you should have a threshold for using other means, like we can give beta blockers for atrial ablation and anticoagulants rather than using arrhythmia suppression. It is not any different. I clearly told you there's no difference between the cancer patients in terms of treating arrhythmias compared to general population. Another question from Dr. Doot. Is the QTC automatically reported by modern ECG machines reliable? I can tell you, we don't most of the time calculate it. But ideally, yes, you should calculate. But modern machines are, in my opinion, very, very reliable. I have not seen it going haywire just like that. So you can definitely use it. Another question, if patient on checkpoint inhibitors with no previously known cardiac morbidity develops low ejection fraction, what years are necessary? Years means, see, there are two types of myocarditis associated with checkpoints. One is the fulminant kind of one, which probably brews up over a period of weeks, typically under 3 months. They present with heart failure. That's a common form of it. That's what we know about it. But there's probably a kind of a smoldering myocarditis, which may be happening in many patients with on immunotherapy. The patient can present as late as 1 year. Or you may not see an active disease at that time, then the disease may be smoldering. In fact, see the immune checkpoints like PD-L1 and CTLA4, these two receptors are actually upgraded in any kind of myocarditis. They are protective. So if you unleash the immune system, then it is necessarily all patients with on immunotherapy should have some kind of myocarditis. But what we clinically recognize is the one which presents frank heart failure. That may be only the tip of the iceberg. So you see those patients who present with a frank heart failure, the risk of death is 50%. If you don't treat them steroid, outcomes are very, very bad. Those patients who comes with a complete heart block, risk is very high. Those patients with VT, the death rate may be close to 90%. So you cannot have a disease like that. It's probably a smoldering kind of myocarditis which is missed, which may be seen in many patients with immunotherapy. Right now, we are monitoring all patients with immunotherapy with GLS and LV function with the 3D echocardiography. And we can see many of them have subtle LV dysfunction, some of them have significant LV dysfunction, and very few of them will only require to be, the drug has to be discontinued. If you look at the current recommendation, current recommendations on immunotherapy, any kind of myocarditis, immunotherapy has to be stopped. But that is not real. That is based on the data of earlier times where we had frank myocarditis and death. But looking at the pathology, looking at what actually happens, immune myocarditis is probably part and parcel of immunotherapy. So many of them will have mild LV dysfunction. That patients can be continued on immunotherapy and you can follow it up. Doxorubicin usually does not cause rhythm issues. That is not really true. Doxorubicin, when you infuse itself, patient can have very frequent VPCs. Outcome of that may not be really true, but the reported incidence of VT and VPCs are very, very common. We do not usually monitor rhythm in patients with doxorubicin, which is usually not done. It's not usually of consequences. But if the QTC prolongation associated with using arsenic trioxide, they definitely need monitoring. We do take ECG in them every day. We tell the patient this is the only way out because the arrhythmia can be deadly. 50% of the patients on arsenic at some point of time, during the 27 to 29 days of course you usually give, will have QTC more than 500 at some point of time. So in them you have to monitor daily, but for others you don't require. So opinion about borderform related LV dysfunction. That a patient with DVD or how to differentiate LV dysfunction is due to borderform, which is very difficult. It's very difficult. Thing is, see, the LV dysfunction in this patient with borderform or any of them, it could even be stress-induced LV dysfunction. So we are not right now sure about it. But borderform can cause systolic LV dysfunction, but Carfilzomib usually does not cause systolic LV dysfunction. So that is one major advantage of Carfilzomib. Though Carfilzomib can cause more arrhythmias, I have not stopped a single patient. I have never told oncologists to stop Carfilzomib because of the atrial fibrillation. I tend to manage atrial fibrillation, control the rate well, and put the patient on continued Carfilzomib. We have not stopped it at all. But borderform, since it causes systolic dysfunction, I am a little bit worried about it. What's the cause of bradycardia? Sometimes CV lines sometimes also cause bradycardia. How to deal with them? It is difficult. See, the bradycardias are most of the time, except in patients who have something like myocarditis, bradyarrhythmias are usually not associated with bad outcomes. So we really don't go after bradycardia most of the time. When the patient is in the hospital, bradycardias are reported. Even it's very common with when Taxol. But even in Taxol, if the patient is on additional beta blockers, you can stop that rather than stopping the oncotherapy. So we don't tell oncologists to stop their medicine, and we rather stop our medicine like beta blockers. Trastuzumab also probably doesn't have any arithmogenicity. Trastuzumab per se is not very arithmogenic, but the thing is, if the patient has radiation exposure, probably, yeah, the incidence of arrhythmia may be higher. With an advantage of trastuzumab induced LV dysfunction is, however severe it is, except in 1 or 2% of the patients, this trastuzumab induced LV dysfunction and arrhythmias are completely reversible by 6 months. So if someone is supposed to get trastuzumab, probably you should continue with that. There's no need to stop it. Beta blockers and amiodarone, aren't they the safest antiarrhythmics? Beta blockers, yes. Amiodarone, I'm not sure. Probably not. Amiodarone can cause proarrhythmia. Plus, amiodarone can also cause LV dysfunction. So if somebody is on already has LV dysfunction, if you start on amiodarone, the cardiac EF can actually drop, and then especially when you give it IV, currently, the rapid or ejection fraction, that may be more detrimental. So I most of the time prefer patients to start on beta blocker and anticoagulation. And then if it does not respond and if the rhythm cannot be controlled well, then think of other measures. I'm not a good fan of amiodarone.
Yeah, so one last
I don't think it is a very safe drug.
Yeah. So nowadays we also see there are so many patients who are being started on ivabradine by cardiologists for controlling heart rate.
Yes.
Now, do you think this ivabradine has any implications with our treatment or any interactions and with cardiac causing cardiac arrhythmia with the cancer?
Yes, ivabradine basically blocks the if current, so it reduces sinus rate. So if a patient has a substrate for developing atrial fibrillation, a drop in the sinus rate can probably precipitate AF. Okay. Having said that, there's something very funny. It's not that it acts only on the if current. Those patients who have atrial fibrillation and you are putting on beta blocker, you're putting on amiodarone, and if the rate cannot be controlled, adding the ivabradine to them can actually control the rate, because it do act in the AV node too. It's not just only in if current. But theoretically, yes, if you use ivabradine, it can precipitate more atrial fibrillation.
I think, sir, it was a very, very scintillating session listening to, different aspects of arrhythmia with cancer drugs, and then you going on to answer so many of our questions. I think the questions are probably never going to end. So many, many thanks, Dr. Rakesh, for giving us this wonderful session. We'll proceed on to the next session, whereby we will have two interesting case presentations on some 5FU related cardiotoxicity. Dr. Bhavesh Parekh is going to present one case, and Dr. Bharat Bhosle is going to present the next case, and then we will have our expert panelists from oncology side, Dr. Amish Vora, and from cardiology side, Dr. Vinayak Agarwal, to just answer a few queries that will be given by Dr. Bhavesh and Dr. Bharat about their cases, and we can also have audience questions in this session. Thank you. So I would invite Dr. Bhavesh Parekh to please start his case presentation. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. Thank you, Vivek. Just I'm sharing my slides.
So Vivek, I have a suggestion like that. Now all the presentations should probably be pre-recorded. And we had a wonderful session for the Heart Failure Society where everything was pre-recorded and everything was in time, and people joined, the presenter joined only for the discussion.
Yeah, that is actually a good suggestion, sir. But it all has pros and cons. Pre-recorded does really takes out the thrill of the live presentation also. The emotion which is associated with live presentation. So sometimes it's a plus minus. There are speakers, sir, who often are stressing on pre-recorded sessions, and we are comfortable.
Sessions goes stop free, it's like smooth.
Yeah, I totally agree, sir. I totally agree. Your point is totally taken, sir. Probably next session we would stress more on that. Thank you, sir.
So is it my screen is visible to all?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you, first of all, organization, Asian Cardio-Oncology Society, ECOS, and Dr. Vivek Agarwala. This is my first case presentation, 5FU cardiotoxicity. So for this patient having a male 68 years, uh, already diagnosed a case of CA anterior tongue. It is a moderately differentiated squamous cell carcinoma, diagnosed in August 2020. At that time, the complaint of excess salivation and slurring of speech, as well as there is a pain. And the MRI neck is suggestive of 52 by 32 by 24 millimeter mass lesion, left side on the anterior part of the tongue. There was no comorbidity, no diabetic, no hypertension. Finally, patient has consulted a surgeon, and surgeon feels that we should give neoadjuvant chemotherapy followed by surgery oblique chemo radiation, concurrent chemo radiation. Patient has received TPF, that is neoadjuvant chemotherapy protocol. In that docetaxel, cisplatinum, and 5-fluorouracil has been given. 5-fluorouracil has been given as a continuous infusion. The first cycle received in the month of August, and second cycle is received in the month of September. So when the patient has received, before this neoadjuvant chemotherapy, we had done a cardiac evaluation, and cardiac evaluation as far as the ECG and echo, both cardiac evaluation has been done, and ejection fraction was 60% with normal LV systolic function. Now the last dose or the second dose has been given on the September 2020. The first dose, the mild toxicity, there was some diarrhea, and patient has been admitted for 2 or 3 days for diarrhea, and patient recovered very well. So now this is the presentation of the toxicity. The post chemotherapy, it was 9th day. The patient has received the protocol, TPF protocol, that is on the 18th of September, and 28th of September, patient admitted with the dyspnea on exertion and fever. On presentation, with this presentation, we had done a routine hematological parameter where the WBC count was 800, but still the patient having normal ECG. And the echocardiogram has been done, and it was 50% with fair LV systolic function and right mild pericardial effusion. The interesting point here is the tropo-I was done, and it was 26,638 with procalcitonin 70.80 and with C-reactive protein 292. Patient also developed hypotension, and patient is already on support on noradrenaline drip. We feel that it may be a septicemic shock. We had done a blood culture, urine culture, and stool culture, and everything is normal. The interesting point, after 4 days from C-reactive protein, it was 292 on the presentation, it went to 54. It was almost 6 times decrease in the previous figure. Now, another important point is tropo-I. The tropo-I was 26,600 and it went to 3,500. We consulted day 1 cardiologist, and we expected that if you require do angiography or angioplasty, the cardiologist is damn sure, Bhavesh, this is just a viral infection or septicemic shock or is an inflammatory reaction. We don't want to do anything. Now the WBC count from 816 went to 18,740. It was almost normal or above normal because of the GCSF support. Still ECG is normal, and patient is now off pressure support, like off noradrenaline and off any drugs. My question or my discussion is that is it a viral infection? Is it a myocarditis? Is it a temporary cardiac damage? Or is it an inflammatory reaction? We had not given a third cycle of TPF, and although it was a very good response on the MRI, and we directly proceed for the concurrent chemoradiation as patient refused for surgery. There was excellent response on the anterior part of the tongue, and neck node is almost disappeared. So this is my case presentation. Over to organizer.
Yeah. I think, sir, you have a very relevant question. So, Dr. Amish.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, Dr. Amish, Dr. Bhavesh just presented his case. I hope you were able to follow the case.
Yes, I was. I have
Yeah,
taken
sir.
down some
So,
notes also for Bhavesh Bhai.
so, sir, what do you think? He had his questions. So, whether do you think this is a drug toxicity, or whether do you think this was an infective, or whether you can think myocarditis, or it was just some reactive reaction? What is your opinion, sir? And how should you go about evaluating this patient from your end? We'll come to Dr. Vinayak then.
Right. Normally I would pick up a call to Dr. Vinayak whenever I see these type of things, and I'll discuss with him. But assuming he's not available and he's going to talk later, day 11 of TPF, patient presented, and day 12, all these processes have started. Acute chemotoxicity is going to be lower on the cards. The delayed chemotoxicity on the heart is something which we see, but in this patient, going by the picture, and Dr. Bhavesh was kind enough to give us a follow-up also, I personally think this is most likely a neutropenic sepsis rather than any drug-related cardiac toxicity one. We see stress induced drop in ejection fraction all the time. We see C-reactive protein and procalcitonin high all the time. TROP-I normally we don't do, and because if the echo was okay, I would not have done TROP-Is otherwise also in this patient. So that is something which I do not want to explain right now, but minus TROP-I, everything else fits into neutropenic sepsis, stress-induced cardiomyopathy, which recovered after the supportive care and IV antibiotic. Cultures can be negative 60 to 70% of the times. Earlier, it used to be negative 80 to 90% of the times. Now, almost 40 to 50% of patients we find culture something. But just because in neutropenia cultures were negative does not rule out neutropenic sepsis. That would be my conclusion in this patient, and I would like others' opinion as well.
Yeah, Dr. Vinayak.
Yeah.
So, sir, febrile neutropenia and reduced ejection fraction and increased TROP-I with other inflammatory markers. So, how much would you sort of consider this being myocarditis also, or some sort of a viral myocarditis, or would you also go with what Dr. Amish has said, that this is just stress-related, sepsis-related cardiomyopathy? And how do you go about treating this case?
So actually, it's a very interesting case and very well documented as well. See, there are few temporal associations that we should look into. You have a very rapidly rising troponin I's with some fall in ejection fraction from baseline of 60 to 50%. We don't have subsequent echoes, or nobody's done a strain imaging, advanced strain imaging, which we recommend in most such cases pre and post chemo nowadays. The fact is that there was something which caused a huge release of troponin in thousands. Now, stress cardiomyopathies are known to, there can be three types of stress cardiomyopathies. One is when there is a global hypokinesia, the global variety. The other is the typical apical ballooning syndrome. And the third is the reverse Takotsubo or the squid variety. Probably this was more like a global cardiomyopathy. More for me, and more, usually you don't see such high increases in stress cardiomyopathy. Right? You either see it in acute coronary syndromes where the patient will have some ECG changes, will have ST elevations or significant ST changes. And typically they present with chest pain or frank failure in these cases. The other possibility is more of a drug toxicity, something like a bang, something came, had a severe effect on the LV myocardium, and then once it was stopped, it kind of very rapidly moved away in a short duration, and there was a rapid fall in the troponin levels. Myocarditis, you would not expect it to get relieved so soon because it's an inflammation, so it would last for a few days. It would also have significant ECG changes, it will be more prolonged course and not such a rapid decrease in troponins as we saw. The other thing which I would like to say is that what we're probably looking at is a subclinical LV dysfunction where the ejection fraction did not fall so much, if we assume that it was 50% throughout, but there was still a massive release of troponin I in this case. So I would go more in, I would partly agree with Dr. Amish as well, that this can be a multifactorial manifestation. Drug toxicity can be FU. Sometimes the actual fall in ejection fraction may be a little later than maybe a little 1 or 2 days later, or maybe a few days later. But the subclinical LV dysfunction is pretty much evident. We've seen ejection fractions of 50, 55 with global longitudinal strains of 5, 6, -5, -6, which are significantly low. So I think we should keep a multifactorial etiology. Either way, your management doesn't change. You will treat this patient with supportive care if the patient is in shock. Usually in sepsis, we don't recommend IABP, but if the patient is really sick and is in shock, and if you think that the cardiogenic shock is responsible for it, you could go for an IABP. The supportive care, of course, remains as with inotropes. If the BP allows you, then ACE inhibitors and beta blockers are pretty good. Ivabradine, I agree with Dr. Rakesh. He said is fast coming up more like an offline indication to be used in these cases to decrease the heart rate. But we don't have enough data in acute decompensated heart failure situations, but we do use it sparingly in certain situations. So that's my take on it.
Sir, my question, sorry, Dr. Vinayak Agrawal, my question is that when we as a clinician, as an oncologist, when we have to explain at least once in a day to a critical ill patient, a relative, especially when the relative is also one of the cardiologists or one of the anesthesiologists, not cardiologists, that what is the reason for rising the tropo I and why you are not going for angiography or any other evaluation. By chance, this patient develops acute MI and you had not taken any measures to deal with the acute MI. What should be our call?
Dr. Vinayak, before Dr. Vinayak answers, can I give oncological perspective, and then Bhavesh bhai, we can ask Dr. Vinayak to give a cardiological perspective. Dr. Vinayak, correct me if I'm wrong, but once upon a time, there was a very strong argument about including troponin I in a septic protocol, in a sepsis protocol, one. And second thing is almost like 70 to 80% of patients with septic shock will have trop I elevated. And all these patients, those who have elevated trop I and sepsis confirmed, almost 70% of these patients do not have any coronary artery syndrome. So this is what I understand. But yes, Dr. Bhavesh has an extremely valid point in today's age and world. I would want you, Dr. Vinayak, to write on the file in this patient that patient does not require angiography from the legal perspective. Absolutely correct. Over to you, Dr. Vinayak.
So see, I think the right way to look at it is how the patient presents. For example, if the patient presents with significant STT changes, ST elevation, or significant ST depressions, patient is in shock, there's a significant troponin rise, I am well within my say purview to go for a check angiography in these patients to rule out underlying coronary artery disease. However, if the patient is really sick, sometimes these patients are terminal patients where intervening with stenting or to, it could be due to, in this particular scenario, the troponin I can simply be because of increase of in sepsis. Sepsis, the troponins can go up. If clinically the patient is terminal and we don't want to intervene in terms of angioplasty or angiography, I may go simply for a conservative treatment with IABP if required at all, after discussion with the patient's family. This is a two-way process. It's a discussion, and troponin is no way an indicator of MI. It is more of what it means is basically myocardial injury. Whether it fits into a myocardial ischemia or not is a clinical judgment which we have to take as a cardiologist. depending on the patient's presentations.
It's typically
So,
a mismatch.
angiography. Sorry.
Can I say it is typically due to demand mismatch? No, it is. If you say it's an MI, it is an
Absolutely,
MI.
it
It is
could
a
be
type 2.
myocardial injury. Yeah.
Yeah. It only means the demand
Yeah.
mismatch.
So my question to Dr. Vinayak and Dr. Rakesh both is, this patient, when he presented, the TLC was 870 and absolute neutrophil count must be much less than that, maybe less than 100. On one side, we are worried about missing the coronary artery syndrome. On the other side, we do not want the patient to move and go to cath lab for any of the intervention. He may further cause infection. So if the echo shows just drop in 10% from 60% to 50% with a good LV function, and there is just mild global hypokinesia with ECG being normal, what are the chances of this patient actually having coronary artery syndrome? I think let me put that way. Bhavesh bhai, if you agree with that question or you want to add something.
I will say the chance of significant occlusive CAD in this patient will be practically nothing. See,
I agree.
This is all over the
I would
place.
not send this patient for angio.
Yeah, we will not take him for angiography at all. We should not.
I think
Same thing happened with the corona. With the troponin elevation, everything, everybody was saying all over the place and MI. Actually, during COVID, not a single patient was reported to have a elevation MI out of COVID. It is zero report.
I think, sir, there are a lot of questions that we have, and even I also wanted to ask, but I think we will quickly take up the next case that Dr. Bharat Bhosle wants to discuss. Probably then we will also have some more interesting, questions coming up, and then we can take those together in some time. Dr. Bharat, please go ahead with your case presentation, sir. Dr. Bharat is a renowned medical oncologist from Mumbai, and is associated with Bombay Hospital. Yeah, Dr. Bharat, you have to unmute yourself.
Your mic, sir.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Vivek and Kavina Creations for creating such a wonderful platform to discuss all these cases, which are. I'm not able to move my.
Sir, can you use your arrow keys, sir?
Yeah. So I quickly go through the history. Recently, I came across this unfortunate patient who was young, relatively young, and she has a ovarian mass. The ascitic fluid was showing signatoring cells. So actually, it was a case of mucinous carcinoma of Ori with signatoring cells, which were suggestive of a upper GI tract, like stomach or pancreas. We tried to settle the diagnosis, but ultimately she was a fit patient. All the cardiac workup, including the stress workup, was normal, absolutely normal. And she actually was a family person from a cardiologist from the family. So she actually underwent a cytoreduction surgery upfront for HIPAC. We will not go into details of that. And there was a complete cytoreduction with the HIPAC. She tolerated surgery well, actually discharged within 7 or 8 days. So it was a fantastic tolerance for a very high-risk surgery. And subsequently, we know after a month, we evaluated her for adjuvant therapy and decided to offer, because it was mucinous and signatoring cell, we decided to start with the 5FU-based protocol. Now, this patient underwent a port incision because she required for 48 hours of 5FU infusion. We started the chemotherapy, the first bolus and the 5FU 23 hours was uneventful. It was the next day, midnight, the second infusion started. I had a call with the on-call because she was admitted under a cardiologist in cath lab. The cath lab was next to her. She was in cardiac ICU. So perfect monitoring was there as she was admitted under cardiologist. In the night time, the second infusion was started. There was some technical problem with the port. So actually the second trip was not, even if it was started at 11, there was no infusion went time. So actually she received a 50% dose. So a 50% dose of 5FU was given. In the morning, I went for the rounds. There was no angina, there was no sweating, no complaints. But I looked at the patient on the day 1 and day 3 morning. There was severe fatigability. And the only sign was a tachycardia, which was 120, 124. So that struck me, and then I immediately called the cardiologist that I feel, and ECG was normal. So it was a sinus tachycardia. There was no STP changes, no ST sagging. So we decided quickly to act, and we sent the cardiac enzymes. CPK, MB, and rest all normal. Trop, I was slightly elevated, the upper level of normal and just above that. So the cardiologist said, we can neglect it, but still we decided to do a 2D echo. Baseline workup absolutely normal. The 2D echo shows 20% ejection fraction. So fortunately, that 5FU was actually stopped after the first infusion because of the port non-functioning. And the 50% of the dose already had gone. What I usually do for the first cycle, I give 75% of the dose because we know that some of the patients are DPD mutant. And I had, unfortunately, in the past, had seen one patient who had severe mucositis, diarrhea. So I start with the first dose as a 75% dose, out of which 50% dose was received by the patient. So the cardiologist came into picture and they started managing this patient. What happened? Her heart rate and everything settled. But the next day morning, so we are going beyond cardiology now. The next day morning, I got a call that she has totally altered sensorium. She has a dystonia and typically a neurological case. So immediately MRI was done in-house. And there was a diffuse metabolic kind of encephalopathy. So you have a cardiomyopathy and you have an encephalopathy. So neurologist came into picture and high dose steroid pulse was started. So 5 days course was given. So luckily, on the 4th day onwards, she started improving. Ejection fraction returned to 50% within 4 days. The neurologically, she completely recovered within 7th day. We asked her to go around the hospital 4-5 rounds. Clinically, absolutely fine. On day 10, she was planned discharge. She was actually discharged. Meanwhile, because of the cardiology thing, she was on low molecular weight heparin. And after the discharge, she was about to go home. She had a projectile vomiting. So the RMO on duty said, don't go. And we immediately admitted and she collapsed immediately after readmission. A repeat MRI was done. There is an intracerebral bleed, which intraventricular extension. And subsequently, patient had a stomic course and operated twice for the brain problem, which was never reported in the literature regarding the whatever drugs we gave. Her CBC was absolutely normal till day 10. Her liver functions were absolutely normal. Her renal functions absolutely were normal. There was no mucositis. There was no signs of myelosuppression, no diarrhea, no vomiting. The only problem started like acute cardiomyopathy, acute encephalopathy, treated, recovered. And after 10 days, there was an IC bleed. Something unusual I came across in my 10-15 years of practice. So there are expert cardiologists, there are expert oncologists. I think we can discuss these issues so that in the future we can be more elaborated about the knowledge about using this drug. Because 5FU is a drug which we use in day-to-day practice. And there are unfortunate patients who develop myelosuppression, mucositis, but this is something neurotoxicity, something unheard of. And neurotoxicity as well as cardiotoxicity in single patient, there I haven't heard any reports also.
Yeah. So really a wonderful case by Dr. Bharat. I remember Dr. Bharat called me and we discussed. I went through the literature search and I could found only one case that has been recently reported where a patient had both cardiotoxicity and neurotoxicity. So so I straight ahead go ahead with Dr. Vinayak. Dr. Vinayak, what is your thought process when you see that a patient had cardiotoxicity, which probably seemed like a acute 5FU cardiotoxicity?
Yeah.
And then subsequently you have a neurotoxicity. Whether you call it a neurotoxicity or whether it is a sequelae of the cardiotoxicity, or something else coming into the picture. It's a vascular phenomena again happening in both the hearts and the lungs, hearts and the brain. I mean, how do you explain this?
So see, I think if you look at the temporal association again, this is a very clear-cut acute FU cardiotoxicity. And there are multiple mechanisms which have been proposed for 5FU cardiotoxicity, and most common probably being coronary vasospasm. but there are also mechanisms which have been proposed, which are very similar to, myocardial infarction. So there is platelet aggregation and thrombotic occlusion, which has been seen in these patients, mainly because of levels of von Willebrand factor. There is also Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which we just discussed, stress cardiomyopathy. They have also described mitochondrial uncoupling and reduced aerobic efficiency leading to myocarditis with direct myocardial damage. So there are multiple mechanisms which have been proposed for 5-FU toxicity, cardiotoxicity. And this looks very typically, you give infusion and within a day or two, you come up with a significant fall in ejection fraction to 20%, as in this case. As far as the encephalopathy is concerned, it's difficult to say whether it was part of, we have to see what was the electrolytes like, whether there was respiratory distress, hypoventilation, or was it some thrombotic episodes, microangiopathy. We don't know what it could be. It could very simply be a metabolic encephalopathy that we're looking at in this case.
Just to give you a perspective, sir, I mean, I looked at whether there can be a 5-FU related encephalopathy. And there is a mechanism proposed that there can be cerebral vasospasm, just as there is a coronary vasospasm. Right. And they say that because of this cerebral vasospasm there is. So, when I looked at this case, it appears to me as if the patient had, a coronary vasospasm as well as a cerebral vasospasm. And when the early recovery of the both encephalopathy as well as the cardiomyopathy tells me that it is probably drug related. The reversibility, the reversible nature of this illness. And then probably, in a ischemic brain or in this kind of a situation, when you give low molecular weight heparin, so there can be a possibility of the bleed, IC bleed. This is because of some interaction with the vessels, whereby in a ischemic vessels which are in vasospasm, when they expand, so there is some theory related to
So Vivek, Vivek, so we discussed with many neurologists, because this was like some rarest of the phenomena. And there is also a possibility of some microaneurysm which went into spasm. That is also a possibility, because it cannot be picked up because we did not do MR angio because it's a metabolic encephalopathy and it was not emergency, so it was not planned. So microaneurysm, and the bleed was intracerebral. So there is a possibility of 2-3 hypotheses now. But one more.
Ischemic infarcts can actually turn hemorrhagic. All this.
But sir, she had a sudden onset projectile vomiting and a sudden onset. So it's like an acute.
After discharge,
and it really, this is a major possibility that probably there was an aneurysmal rupture, an aneurysm which had probably been in under spasm. When they have released, the spasm is released, they have a possibility of going rupturing, So a very, very, Dr. Amish.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So what is your opinion on this kind of a complicated case? I mean, it's an oncologist's nightmare to have this case
absolutely.
When the case
I had gone through
Bharat, I can imagine what Bharat must have gone through.
My ectopic rate has increased. My ectopic rate had gone
patient admitted in cath lab for chemo and cath lab requirement is something unusual.
I know.
So
basically, it's
my experience, Bharat. Encephalopathy-like picture, I have seen a lot with 5-FU. Disorientation, patient having headache, which is relieved by beta blocker, patient having some encephalopathy, you give beta blocker and it gets relieved. It's not uncommon. I have seen quite a number of patients. In terms of ejection fraction dropping to 20% is something which we see unusual, but our first case of 5-FU toxicity, which Dr. Vinayak and myself, we had presented, where typical presentation and with IABP patient improved. In your case, patient improved on its own without IABP. The 10th day of intraparenchymal bleed or intracerebral bleed, I feel is that something which is not seen by any of one of us in last so many years. So I don't think that it can be anywhere related to 5FU toxicity unless and until we see a cluster of patients. And like people said, or the neurologist said, that there is some aneurysm which had bleeding during this all stress episode, can be one of the possibilities. You would not rule out, and we should not blame ourselves for every small, not for every major side effect which happens during chemotherapy. I have not seen a single case of bleeding anywhere in the body post 5FU. Also, what I wanted to understand is that, Bharat, there are two questions. One, HIPAC was done, 7th, 8th day, patient was relieved, and there was some stomach with bilateral ovarian masses. So was this Krukenberg's tumor? That is one thing which I wanted to ask you. If it is Krukenberg's tumor, by any chance, did you do any MRI of the brain before you started with FOLFOX, just to document that there was nothing in the brain which was there?
Yeah. So,
and second thing is, was the baseline echo before FOLFOX was done?
Yeah, so there was nothing in the brain because MRI was done immediately after the first episode. It was clear. There was no metastasis or MRI brain with contrast was done. So there was no brain metastasis. About the primary, we evaluated in detail because the patient belongs to a cardiologist family. Each and every person of each specialty, gynecology, you name the specialty, I'll tell you the name. Everyone was involved in evaluation case. I was behind the gastroenterologist because gastroenterologist said, do PET scan. It is not a GI tumor. You just go ahead with the ovarian protocols. So we did PET scan. There was nothing in the GI tract. We did upper GI scopy, lower GI scopy, nothing. But the biopsy was done and reviewed twice at Center of Oncopathology, Dr. Jay Mehta and Dr. Boji's center. Then they said there are no, this primary looks from the GI. Even if there is nothing in the GI, no, we see sometimes no primary goes. And there was the highly no stomach primary because of patient's mother also died of the stomach cancer. So possibility of Krukenberg, but there were no brain metastasis.
So Dr. Vinayak, I wanted to ask you that any amount of low LVEF for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, will it ever cause intracerebral bleeding by any of the mechanism which we know? See, we know it may cause brain damage because of the less blood supply or because the ischemia happening in the brain also. I have seen a lot of vasospasms amounting to headache and disorientation for some time, then again comes back after beta blocker. But will it cause intracerebral bleeding?
No. See, I think we are trying to explain the intracranial bleed by connecting it to 5FU or some other mechanism. I think it's a separate issue completely.
True, I agree.
It could have been, we don't really know. Sometimes the heparin or the low molecular weight heparins that we give could be one of the issues, whether it's a dosing issue or whether it's just an idiosyncratic presentation that we can't really predict. We know that any of these are double-edged swords. Even in a pretty normal non-oncology patient also they can bleed, though the bleeding risk is less than 0.5%. But we know that these are double-edged swords. So I think the intracranial bleed probably can be explained secondary to the anticoagulants which we use. The other is, I don't think 5FU toxicity led to intracranial hemorrhage. Encephalopathy, yes, we can explain, but not the hemorrhage part. Then you're also looking at this patient who has widespread cancer, and a lot of these patients can have microscopic or microaneurysms, etc., which can burst, which may not be picked up even on best of the scans. So I think we can probably leave ICH from the gamut of 5FU related toxicity. It's just a coincidental finding that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think
LMWH during low LVEF, what are the chances of intracranial bleeding?
So traditionally, we avoid the LMWH in more than 75 years age group normally, because we have seen higher risk of bleeding in that elderly age group. Otherwise, all our patients, wherever it is indicated with EF low, are given low molecular weight heparins, especially in the acute coronary syndrome conditions. Sometimes if you feel that there is a large aneurysm at the apex or somewhere in the heart after cardiac remodeling, and there is a chance of the patient developing a clot. It's a cardiologist's prerogative to start them on low molecular weight heparins, though it's not a class 1 or class 2 indication as such. So we use it pretty often, and it is quite safe actually if you use it judiciously.
So 5FU related cardiotoxicity, I mean, should we use LMWH in use routinely? Is there any role of LMWH there?
Not that it is documented anywhere. See, traditionally what is recommended is that immediately you abort the chemotherapy, which we all do. The recommended drugs which have been tried are the diltiazem, nifedipine, and nitrates. There is a drug which is uridine triacetate, but we don't really have it in India to be used for antidote. So I think beyond that, molecular weight heparins, if you want to use, probably will not be secondary to the LV dysfunction, but due to any other reasons, whether it is DVD prophylaxis or the patient has any additional thrombosis anywhere in the body, yes, you would be using them, but not really directly for 5FU toxicity.
Yeah, I think, I think we should stop the discussion, because the discussion probably would go on, and we have, so many questions. Thank you. I thank Dr. Amish and Dr. Vinayak for answering the questions. I thank Dr. Bhavesh and Dr. Bharat for their excellent case presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next, I would invite Dr. Indu Bansal. She is the chairman of the ACOS newsletter committee, and she is a radiation oncologist working in NCR. So the idea of this session is to sort of discuss on how we can go about the coming second Asian Cardio-Oncology newsletter, as well as to sort of request everyone to sort of contribute with different sort of materials, articles, or whatever you may feel like, and also suggestions on how we should go about our Asian Cardio-Oncology Society, what as organizers, as sort of what we can more do to justify our positions, and to sort of do more in Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. So over to you, Dr. Indu.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. And I think it was a very wonderful session and beautiful case which was presented. The previous case, it was really interesting, the previous cases. So as you all know that we have launched first newsletter, and which was a very good newsletter. We had tried to give some messages from Dr. Devi Shetty, our honorary secretary, and we had presented some survey also. So this time we wanted this newsletter should reach each and every oncologist who is treating any cancer patient, maybe it a pediatric oncologist, cardio-oncologist, radiation oncologist, medical oncologist, all of us. So I would like all of you to give your suggestions. Dr. Amish is here. Can I request him to please give his suggestions? Dr. Amish, if you are here. You are, yeah.
Yes, I'm here. When Dr. Indu is speaking, I dare not leave the platform. Regarding suggestion for the leaflet, that is what you are asking, right?
Yeah, so the ACOS newsletter, sir.
Right.
So we decided that we would come out with a newsletter every 3 months. So the last newsletter we had where we had some messages as well as some interesting articles that have been published by Dr. Anuprita. I had presented a small survey results that we had done, and then there were some riddles and all. Dr. Indu also had a few messages. So how do you think we should go about the next coming ACOS newsletter?
So again, first of all, congratulations to all of you. This is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful platform. There are no two words about it. What I suggest, the need of the hour about the newsletter or whichever platform you are using is, I think what Bharat presented, what Dr. Bhavesh presented, and what I had seen few of the other presentation, the need of the hour is the cardio-oncology tumor board discussion and presenting that either in the form of the newsletter or it is in the form of an online platform for second opinion. I think that is the need. Every day, Vivek, every day, I'm not joking. You ask Dr. Vinayak, he gets fed up of my calls. Every day we call for something related to heart. Sometimes we are stuck clinically, sometimes we are stuck medico-legally, sometimes we are really stuck whether to treat cancer or whether to treat heart. So I think, and we have number of cases. I had reached out to Dr. Parikh also. Although I did not write an email that can I have a tumor board on cardio-oncology for one of my patient. If we have a regular tumor boards where cardio-oncology consensus is reached, like in Bharat Bhosle's case, I would say that we reached a consensus where the chemotherapy probably is not to be blamed, and it was either incidental, secondary to LMWH or aneurysmal bleed. If we reach these consensus, and if we can present these things in the newsletter form also, that last 2 months we discussed these two interesting cases, and this was the actual discussion. If you see ASCO and ESMO discussion, that is how they put it on their newsletter also, and that is how they put it on their web page also. And there are many a times I read those because I want to know what are the questions asked and how was the answered. So I think that will become a very interesting, Dr. Vivek and Dr. Indu. It would be really, we would wait for the next newsletter, because I don't know the case discussed in that newsletter can be something next day I see that in our day-to-day practice.
I think that's a very, very wonderful suggestion. So I think that's a very strong suggestion, that what we can do is we can put in a case and we can show how that case was managed and what all toxicities were faced and what is the take-home message from that case, which we can carry on for any further patient. So I think that's a very good idea. And online platform for cardio-oncology cases, I think Dr. Vivek, we should discuss with Dr. Purvish Parikh and everyone and start working on that. That sounds like a very good idea. Dr. Rajesh Jindal, I would like you to please give your comments, because I can see you are giving some wonderful suggestions. So Dr. Rajesh has written that just can we be more broad-based, more than a newsletter, and just a page on basics of cardiology? I absolutely agree with him. In fact, I had also noted down that point, that medical oncologists, they are MD people, so they still know how to manage a cardiac case. But as radiation oncologists, we have very limited knowledge of cardio-oncology. So Dr. Rajesh has very nicely suggested that we may include black box warnings of some drugs in newsletter. So that's a wonderful suggestion. Dr. Rajesh, would you like to say, please? Dr. Rajesh, I would like you to unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I've unmuted myself, Dr. Indu, and this is one concern that I have, that we people who come from MD radiotherapy are really short on cardiology.
Yes.
So this thing occurred to me, and I just wrote it down, and I appreciate that you've taken my point. Thank you very much.
So I think that's a very wonderful suggestion. And I was just thinking that in the newsletter, we can have one portion which talks about basic cardiology, like maybe reading an ECG. Simple. I mean, for medical oncologist and DM oncologist, it's easier, but for surgical oncologist and radiation oncologist, it's not that easy. So maybe we can have some small section on basics. Like there could be a simple introductory session on antihypertensive drugs, some basic things.
We could start with reading a proper ECG also, for that matter, because as we've graduated after MBBS, I don't think a lot of MD radiotherapies would know how to read an ECG again.
Dr. Indu, I have this thing. What Dr. Jindal has said is an amazing thing.
Yes.
Black box warning, as simple as somebody who is having a cardiac failure, we give erythropoietin injection. The EPO also has a black box warning in existing cardiac patients.
Precisely.
So just a black box warning ka ek aap daloge na every, I think I would definitely open up that newsletter to see aaj ka black box warning kya hai karke.
Right.
I think this is an excellent suggestion.
So just one more point I was thinking, like at times when patients have to undergo a biopsy, and so we keep on calling our cardiologist and asking them for how many days ecosprin to be stopped, for how many days clopidogrel to be stopped. So can we have some basics from cardiologists or treating oncologist, Dr. Vivek?
Yeah, I think, ma'am, perioperative sort of cardio oncology, as I would say, is something that I had also thought of in addressing in one of the meetings, because in a perioperative period, also, in oncology, not just about chemotherapy patients, but also the surgical oncologist also has to face these cardiology issues. And I am very sure surgeons would also be having questions from cardiologists regarding the fitness for surgery in borderline fit patients who of cardiology, as well as all these questions regarding when to stop what drugs. There are so many drugs that are there are anesthetic issues, and I think we can plan a whole lot meeting on this feature. And it's a good suggestion as to sort of involve surgeons also into this cardio oncology thing.
The more important issue is QT interval calculation and the drugs. There's a lot of many drugs coming up. Newer targeted agents are associated with wrong QT interval, and sometimes no, they are overlooked, and patient may end up into some fatal arrhythmia.
Dr. Bharat, your suggestions for the newsletter, please, and we would like you to contribute in our next newsletter.
Yeah. So most of the newer targeted oral targeted agents are associated with the changes in the QT interval. So there has to be one page on the QT interval, whichever new drug is added and what is its impact. Like in breast cancer or lung cancer, there are drugs which are associated with the QT prolongation, and somebody who is on these drugs, we have to be very careful. As somebody suggested, the ECG, normal ECG, the QT area, sometimes we also end up in forgetting the calculation after years of 10 to 15 years after leaving medicine behind. It is very important.
Great. And do you think we should have some area dedicated on effect of lifestyle, because that is what is responsible for cardiac problems as well as cancer?
Lifestyle, something which I have personally started changing for myself also, and I tell my patients, so I have to adapt for myself. I also faced trouble because of the lifestyle, so that is very, very important. So if as an oncologist, so we should start from ourselves first, so which most of us fortunately have started. Dr. Amish is also very active into marathon now, and I see, and most of us, I think Vivek also will join soon. Vivek Agrawala. So first of all, we must look at our lifestyle, and definitely for the newsletter, that has to be the priority thing, because to some extent lifestyle will prevent the cancer of us. Forget about treating the cancer, it will prevent the cancer, and definitely those who have good lifestyle, they will have a good tolerability to these toxic drugs. That is why that should be a priority. And those who are actually doing a good lifestyle change, or who have recently developed good lifestyle.
Sorry, we can't hear you. We have lost you, please. Any suggestions from the audience on how can we involve students in the newsletter? Because it's very, very important that we involve the MD students, because if they understand the basics of cardio oncology right from the beginning of their career, then all of us can prevent a lot of cardiotoxicities related to cancer treatment. So should we have a student, like last time also Dr. Bhavesh had very rightly suggested that we should have some student section in the newsletter. So any suggestions? Dr. Purvish sir is here. Good evening, sir.
Sorry, I lost my connection.
Yeah, I think Purvish sir had to leave. He had some family function to attend. So just going for that student section, I think, case presentation that we had discussed, we can always have the cases being more and more presented by students, because they are the ones who are our, front line. They are in the front line when they are managing the patients. especially in the teaching institutes.
Yeah,
So
Vivek.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, for the students also, you can allot a drug and cardiotoxicity related drug and a brief review about the drug.
Yeah,
like what
yeah.
we are doing in a IGMPO or drug review. So especially one drug at a time in detail. What are the rarest possible? So it is easier to go through and read at once rather than
That makes a lot of sense to have focus on just one cardiac drug. So maybe can I take it a little further? As you suggested that we can focus on one drug. So suppose like targeted drugs, they have QT intervals. So we are talking about if we are talking about sunitinib for that matter, and say its main effect is QT interval. So in the ECG section, we can focus on the changes on QT interval. I mean, we can correlate it, something like that.
Yes. So like for that matter, we can take a class of drugs like VEGF targeted agents.
Yeah.
So sunitinib for that matter or poziotinib. So those can be clubbed together. 5-FU can go into detail about only 5-FU because it's a drug which is there since 1950 and every day we are see something new about the drug. Even if the drug is being used for so many years, we learn something new in newer the patient, newer the toxicity, and we learn, like this case. I have been reading only 5-FU related things, and the only thing was sticking to mind. We as an oncologist are always blamed about anything. Something goes wrong, the oncologist or the oncology drug for that matter is blamed. Sometimes the side at the same time patient is receiving so many drugs, and there are other drugs which are culprit, which are non-oncology drugs, and we forget reading about those drugs.
Yeah. No, another suggestion was also discussed in the last meeting, whereby there has been a request from cardiologists also.
Yeah.
So, sort of to give a basic oncology teaching to them. And, any suggestions on how we can have a more sort of onco related teaching or onco related information to our cardiologists?
Dr. Gopal is here. Dr. Rakesh Gopal, if he's here, he can give his useful inputs.
So we can start with the breast things, because breast is a disease where as when the patient is stable, we start with doxorubicin and we do a 2D echo of each and every patient. So I think there we can start with something basics about the one disease at a time, and then you can go to those diseases where 5-FU is very commonly used. So basically they will also have an idea what is palliation. So something which is very important. Palliation, adjuvant, neoadjuvant. So intent of treatment is sometimes very important. So they also can suggest if this is the life survival 6 months, then better we can take cardiologist opinion into consideration for best supportive care in some of the cases.
So I think what we can do is for the next newsletter, rather than going into anything fancy, we should focus on basics of cardio oncology, which every oncologist should know. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that I think also sort of is a feature that we should. So maybe we should like focus on one area or one drug or one sort of aspect one at a time, and in the same way for oncologists also. So just recently, I had a patient of CA rectum whom I was treating with FOLFIRI plus bevacizumab. And this patient was being posted by his cardiologist for pacemaker replacement, and the date was given. So I had to like call up the cardiologist to say that, sir, this bevacizumab has been given, so we should wait for 1 month before you go ahead, because he can have some bleeding. And then my cardiologist didn't know about it, so sort of he postponed the case after 15 days. So, this is just small information regarding oncology drugs, which they should be aware of before they are going ahead with their own procedures and all. So if there is any cardiologist in the group, sort of who can suggest that what are the major inputs that they want from oncologists?
Dr. Vinesh? I can see Dr. Vinesh.
Yeah.
Dr. Vinesh is there.
So I think probably most of the people. So anyways, I think ma'am, we had a really wonderful meeting. Once again, I would sort of congratulate all the speakers today for having a really fruitful and wonderful discussion. I would request all the attendants to really involve themselves if they have not taken membership of Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. I would again request you to take membership, and request everyone to try and involve more and more cardiologists and oncologists into this Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. And again, next month, we'll again be meeting on the first Wednesday for Asian Cardio-Oncology Society monthly meeting. And we are also expecting to release our second newsletter at the same time. So with more thanks, I wish you all.
And it's an open call to each and everyone to please contribute for the newsletter, and any suggestions are more than welcome. We would be very, very happy to have you people on board, and please spread the message that the Asian Cardio-Oncology Society is working and a newsletter is being circulated. And we can circulate the previous newsletter also, so that it can be circulated again to the people who have not yet received it. So maybe when we send a thanks note, we can circulate the newsletter again, so that people can be aware that something is being done on these lines.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining in here.
So thanks a lot. Good night.